Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's video, we're talking about the role of artificial intelligence in cybersecurity. Along the way, we'll take a deep dive into how to use AI, focusing on the best strategies for AI in your company's security infrastructure. To discuss that, I'm joined by a major industry expert. With me is Gregor Stewart, VP of AI and Machine Learning at SentinelOne. Gregor, very good to have you with us today.
Hey, great to be here, James. Thank you.
So I think AI is really interesting. I'm concerned a little bit. I think some companies view it as this sort of magic pixie dust, just sprinkle some AI in the hardware, the software, maybe the networking, and it kind of makes everything work better. Uh, I'd like us to go a little deeper than that, so I'll ask you, how exactly does AI help cybersecurity? And in particular, where are the best places to use AI in your security infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great question. I also think that customers are right that they know that AI is of value, right? But it only becomes, meaningful when it's used in specific ways, right? So in cybersecurity in particular, there are like three ways it becomes valuable. The first way is that it enables perception, right, of circumstances, attacks, etc., that would otherwise be very difficult to detect or see, right, with other means, either people, or deterministic software, right. And so the very flexibility of artificial intelligence over traditional software, and its ability to see patterns across, different timescales, many channels, etc., than a person could, right? Make it incredibly valuable, right? So, for example, you might see, a very slow-moving attack, right, which essentially has a number of different components, which, if you were a person looking at logs, right, would be incredibly difficult to see. And if you're a deterministic piece of software, you might only catch small pieces of, right, but not be able to bring it into focus as a whole. So the first one is perception, being able to see things that we otherwise can't see. The second one is a kind of reasoning, which is an ability to flexibly apply a policy, right, to the circumstances, right? So, for example, our policy is none of our sensitive data should leave, certain elements of of our infrastructure, right? And seeing that a certain set of actions is an attempt at exfiltration, that's the one that we said before. But then, how do I either stop it, right, or change configuration to prevent that, right? Is another aspect of the AI advantage, right? So your environment may be different from a more general one, right? And may need specific parameters to be specified so that it can an attack can be rebuffed effectively, let's say, right? And in the past, how this was done was that you would write these little bits of code, right, or no code in these SOAR type environments, right? But it was incredibly difficult to keep up to date as policy changed, right? Now we have the opportunity to do this very flexibly in real time, right? And we'll get into that perhaps a little bit later, right? The third advantage of AI in security, which is really a composite of the first two, is what you might call speed of action, right? So the ability to see things, and the ability to flexibly apply a complex policy, right, in order to either rebuff an attack or or find ways to mitigate potential attacks, right, is probably the chief advantage there, right? Again, ability of an organization to perceive problems and fix them very quickly is at the core of being secure, right? The faster you can do that, right? The more preemptively you could do that, let's say, right? The better.
Mm-hmm. The speed of action, I think it does make a huge difference. On the flip side, what about some of the pitfalls of AI and cybersecurity? And I know that it may not be able to solve every problem every time. The real question is, what should companies be aware of as they deploy AI in their enterprise security?
Really, two key things. The first one is the way in which AI is incorporated into the workflow, right? So I think it can be difficult to make sure you're still getting the best value from human judgment, right? When certain aspects of the work are automated, right? And it can be that AI can detect many more things, right, than people can, can actually triage, right? So if all you've got is really good way of seeing potential threats, right, but you don't also have, a way to help the person triage those potential threats, was it then you haven't really made the enterprise more secure, right? And so you have to balance, the say increased efficacy of detection, right, to see, more stealthy attacks sooner, right? Well before they, bad things happen, with the ability to figure out which things to work on, right? And to assist, analysts in getting those things done, right? So integration into the human workflow. And the second one is, that the kind of additional vector that it adds, right, to these kinds of systems, right? So now I have an element which is in many cases non-deterministic, right? It's very difficult to know how it's going to behave, let's say, especially in the most recent incarnation, LLMs, foundation models, right? Their ability to be creative, right, is prized, right? But that also makes them difficult to keep track of and audit. So, for example, the assistants, right, can be jailbroken, right? And you can get them to say embarrassing things. We've seen this in many different, spheres, right? And those can have consequences, like Air Canada's, having to honor, right, certain, fares because their chatbot said so. So those are the two main things: integration into the human workflow, and the inherent dangers of systems which are non-deterministic, right? And the need to put additional safeguards around them, right?
Right. Makes perfect sense. Well, all right. Let's talk about the SentinelOne cybersecurity offering. Let's drill down into that. I mean, what exactly is Purple AI, and how does it improve a client's cybersecurity?
Right. So first of all, it focuses on helping analysts do things that they do now, right? And so an analyst will essentially one activity that they can undertake is threat hunting, right? So they want to go proactively into the data that the system has been collecting and see if there are threats which haven't been detected, right? Perhaps there's notes on certain activity from a threat actor, right? And they want to see if there are any indications, right, that weren't otherwise picked up, right, in the environment. And this requires them to understand three things at least: what data is being collected, the format that the data is in, and the language in which you query that data, right? And this is quite different, right, from the language in which you think about security problems, right? So you might say, is there this kind of activity in something, in any of these sources? Now I have to think about how I would cast that as a query, right, in a domain-specific language, right? So ours is called Power Query, but there are many others. Splunk has SPL, right, and so on. And so you have to think in that language, right? The security intent that you have, and in order to do that, you also have to understand what data is there and how it's structured, right, in order to effectively craft a query. So just to summarize there, often answering security-related questions, right, that you do in the course of, say, threat hunting, requires you to translate your natural thought into a domain-specific language, and you have to have all this knowledge of the data set and its structure. So one of the things that Purple does is help you avoid having to know those things, right? And so you can stay at the level of intent. You ask a natural language question, it gets turned into a query, for the security data lake, or singularity data lake, as we call it now, right? And you get a response back. Now, that response could be a very large table, right? So the next step is to take that information and to contextualize it and essentially summarize it, right? So take the important parts of it for the question that you actually had, right? And then try to answer the question, let's say. So if you say, have I been targeted by Fin12, a named threat actor, right? I'm going to say, signs of Fin12 would be this kind of activity, or these, these indicators of compromise, let's say, right? I'll go and search for any of those. I'll bring it back, and then ideally you would want an answer like yes or no, right? And then an explanation of the things that have been seen. So this is the main flow, right? So you would call this assistive, right? In that it's helping you do something that you've decided to do, right? It's removing a bunch of knowledge and work that you would otherwise have to undertake.
Can I ask you a question about that? Well, I think it's really interesting in that. So it's a natural language query. If I'm correct in thinking that, that means that someone who is maybe a security administrator who's really in a hurry can handle that better, or maybe there's a junior person on duty that, you know, at 3 in the morning. So it really assists people in any number of ways that the natural language query really helps people.
That's right. You hit on exactly the two core use cases here. Someone who is less skilled, right, or less knowledgeable, more generally, can be augmented, right, and so they can be useful with a little less skill, not with no skill, right, and also a person who is able, right, who already is experienced, right. Certain aspects of query writing is still going to take even an expert 15 minutes of time, let's say, right? And if that can happen in a minute and be refined through natural language, get through an awful lot more of this work. One last thing to say here is that in many ways, the value of Purple sits on top of the value of the Singularity Data Lake. One of the things that makes a conversational assistant possible is that the data system responds in conversational time. And in many other prior platforms, right, and in fact, many modern platforms, right, the response time is still too slow, right, to facilitate that kind of conversational approach, right? So in many ways, Purple sits on top of SDL, right, and much of its advantage is derived from that, right?
Anything else we should know about Purple, about how Purple makes a difference for clients?
Yeah. So not only does it reduce the amount of time required to get usable answers, right, from a system that you may not know much about, right, but it also would guide you through suggestion, turn by turn, right. So you would ask a question, you get a response, and it would suggest next steps, if you like, right, which would nudge you in the direction of, say, a more comprehensive or precise investigation, right, of the kind that you seem to be undertaking. It doesn't quite say, "Hey, I'll do this investigation for you right now," but it is nudging you in a good direction, right? Given best practice that we have, in our database. One other thing to say is that it facilitates the transfer of knowledge between people. And the collaboration of people through this essentially context of what we call a notebook, right? So you don't just do your work in a little chat window, right, and might save your chat or whatever. You're doing it in what looks like a data scientist notebook, right? Because much of security analytics work, right, is very much like data science, right? And it's a very specialized kind, right? And so you can save these notebooks, you can extend them later, you can share them with other analysts, right? And they can be used as templates, right, for further work, right? So they have forensic value, they have educational value, and they have just generally communication value as follows, right? One further thing, this second half, right, is that so this is more like Copilot, right? What about autopilot, right? Can you actually lift up, that burden from me so I can focus on, the harder cases, right? So in the second half of the year, Purple brings in more of that, right? Where you'd say, first of all, would say things like, hey, you actioned this item, items that are similar to this item, right? Here, I've got an alert, right? What is it? And I'm telling you, you actioned similar alerts in the past in a specific way, right? Do you want to do that again, right? So a kind of work amplification or consistency, right? You action an item, right? You might say, and then it says, hey, here are a bunch of other items, right, that are very similar. Do you want me to action those in the same way, right? And then, hey, you always do this. Do you want me to automate that for you, right? So there's an interim step there of, again, noticing how people work and then trying to increase consistency, amplify their effort, right, and reduce the amount that they have to spend time on. And then whatever is left over, right, you want to put into the true auto investigation mode where you say, hey, given this alert, and I'm saying that it's not something I can triage out, right, could you automatically investigate it for me? So do what I would do, right, in a flexible way, right? So again, something like, here is an access which looks suspicious. It doesn't look like anything I would normally I've actioned before. Please do the following 20 investigative steps, right? And then tell me what your recommendation is, right? So the idea is we can help you as you do work that you've decided to do. We can help you by essentially taking work that you've already done and spreading it over the additional things that looks like you have to do. And then when it comes to the investigation and actually doing it for you so that you're left with a decision to make, right, rather than a bunch of grind to do. So the whole idea here over the let's say the next 18 months, right, is to go from what is essentially a very high stakes grind. If you miss even one thing, that might be the thing, right, that is the cause of the breach, right, or the beginning of an incident, right? And so it's an incredibly stressful and at the same time tedious kind of work, right? And so the idea is to get the analyst into this mode of validating work that has been done, right, and thinking thoroughly about work that is left, if you like, right? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So the system actually suggests some of its own automations.
Yes. So again, you can observe people doing the same thing again and again, right? On similar alerts or similar indications, and suggest that these things be automated, right? I'll give you an example. Would be many things to do with identity. The response is to force the user to re-authenticate. Right, we're not quite sure if this is a problem or an issue, but really, since it's a low risk action, we should just ask them to re-authenticate, right? And so for many SOCs, that would be the policy, right? You would say, okay, anything like this, force re-authentication, and you want to have that as a kind of observable automation that you have put in place. Now, it's driven by a piece of intelligence, which is it needs to be sufficiently similar, right, to these cases, right, that we've judged should be handled that way, right? So the AI there is just absorbing irrelevant variation, right? If that makes sense.
It does. Well, I think the really fascinating question is, what about the future of AI and cybersecurity? I mean, it's really a question on the minds of many managers. Certainly, that technologies are getting hacking technologies are getting more advanced, even as the good folks improve security. What do you see when you think about the future of AI and cybersecurity?
I mean, there are two kinds of exciting, in some way, that's a word you can use for this, new risk, right? And one of them is this, in principle, undetectable deep fakes, right? So voice is probably already there in terms of, I mean, there are examples in the literature now of people having phone calls from what would seem to be the CFO, right? And essentially spending millions of dollars, right, to the wrong place. And because of the technology underneath there, again, it's going to be very, very difficult, right, to reliably detect those. And video obviously in some ways looks fairly primitive now, right? But
Sure.
given you and I are talking, in this way, and it doesn't have to be particularly high quality, right? To get through, say, a Zoom call in some cases, right? So this is difficult, right? Because this is one way that we've used to protect ourselves, right? From to validate, if you like, right, that we're being communicated with by the people that we expect to be. So one thing we're going to have to evolve is new ways of essentially authenticating one another, right? It's not that they're not available. It's not that they're not, they're already, but we don't use them habitually. We've relied on, right, the shortcut of, seeing one another and hearing one another. So that's one thing. That's kind of exciting. In principle, like, undetectable, right, spoofing, if you like. And the second one is this being used in a way to radicalize people in a very granular way, right? Which, if you think about the dangers, we're often worried about people's credentials being compromised, right? So that leaks can occur because attackers can get in and then move laterally and grab other credentials and then exfiltrate information, right? But there are key examples of where people just do that, right? They don't need to compromise. They do it themselves, right? And I'm thinking of Manning, for example, in the military, right? In the recent past, right, where that person just felt essentially radicalized and then decided to leak a whole bunch of information, right? And often that was because of a long-term issue. But imagine if you were, let's put it this way, imagine if you were a trans person and you were working for a firm and then someone made a deep fake of the company's CEO essentially saying dreadful things, right, about that, and you were exposed to that. In that moment, you may think, I'll show you. I mean, it's not beyond the realm of possibility, right? And so where are the tools for defending against this kind of thing, right? And one part you could say is the best defense is to have everyone's views and and stances well understood and grounded, but that's not always possible in large organizations, right?
Mhm.
So there's a real danger here of rather than us having insecure systems, right, is us having an insecure corporate culture or
Mm.
essentially human element of our
Yes.
organization, and there
Right.
are no tools for that. So a fast developing part of the field will be essentially more like human security, right? How do we help people understand, right, when these kinds of things are true, to feel grounded in our views and our values, right? Yeah, that may sound soft, but again, we've seen the huge consequences, right, of people deciding, right, that this was a good course of action because of the attitudes of either leadership or the organization as a whole.
Well, I think it's a deep irony, to be sure, in that you're saying really some of the protection against some of the technological threats is a better human culture.
Exactly. I mean, and that shouldn't come as a surprise. We often think of security culture as this thing of following processes and not doing certain things, right? And actually, this is writ large across our society, is that what makes us secure is that we have social cohesion, that we understand, one another's, we share one another's, values, and we honor one another, right, in specific ways, right? And that's what makes for resilient organizations, right, socially. And so it's no surprise that it's becoming part of security. And so in some ways, I suppose this would be a final remark would be, uh, this is good for us to realize, right, that at the
Mhm.
foundation of all of our security practice, are these essentially shared social norms and so on. And if we don't protect those, what is it? Then we're vulnerable, right?
I think it's a really important thought, a very important thought. Gregor, I think you said it. A lot of good stuff. I certainly learned a lot. I hope you will come back and talk with us again sometime. Thank you very much.
I'd love to, James. Thank you.